Dankeschön. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So, like we just said, I will hold my presentation in English. I hope it works for everybody. And later on, we can have the discussion in German. Just because I kind of submitted my abstract in English-German a little bit. So I would like to take you on a journey of about 3 years ago. I conducted this research almost 3 years ago, and I had the title Here to Stay, but actually the title should be better, Just Came to Say Hello. And I would like to think with you or go through with you what an occupational career, so in German, Berufspfad, Berufsverlauf, Verweildauer, is actually expressed in a Western Austrian EMS provider. So this research I conducted in 2019, and it's all about how long are people actually staying in this EMS provider, why are they going into EMS, and why are they leaving emergency medical services. And before I do that, I want to take every one of you with me on a little journey to Austria, as I don't know how much in depth you know the Austrian EMS system. Just to give you a brief overview, and I would like to highlight 4 different levels. So firstly, EMS education is kind of different. There's the federal Austrian law on Sanitäter, which consists of, let's say, a modular setup that ranges from a minimum of 260 hours up to a maximum of 1640 hours. Everything is divided into at least 4 different levels or steps. So in practice, most of the EMS staff in Austria take a couple of years to actually advance to the last step, not as you guys in Germany or other countries are used to this kind of school-like system. The Austrian system is quite different. Secondly, composition of staff. Historically, somewhat similar to the situation in Germany some decades ago. Austria has basically 4 main groups, which are occupational staff, so the berufliche, the civil servants, the voluntary social servants, and volunteers. So as you might know, we still have civil service, and a lot of people can do civil service in EMS. Estimates are that around 50,000 people in Austria are affiliated with EMS. So we have about 50,000 people who have at least some kind of affiliation with EMS, and volunteers traditionally play a big role, especially because of a lot of EMS providers have a democratic structure, and they have a lot of influence, the volunteers, in these democratic structures. About 70% of the hours are actually provided by occupational staff and civil servants. And the third point would be that the distribution of qualified personnel is very heterogeneous. So as you can see on this map on the bottom, we have some cities, some of you might know Vienna, that provides a solely municipal ambulance service. So an ambulance service that has a high quota of high educated staff. And at the same time, some rural areas provide or heavily depend on volunteers or civil servants. And as we noticed in Austria, there is a high variety of different SOPs. So in some states, it's allowed to apply medication. In other states, it isn't. Or even the use of airway devices is restricted in some areas. And lastly, the equipment of EMS differs. So within Austria, there is different systems. You can see that the cars, some states have a one car fits it all strategy, and others don't. So what is the problem? The number of civil servants is actually falling over the last years, and demographic changes increase the demand for EMS. Just to give you a brief overview. So when we talk about the number of people who actually are new civil servants over the next years, you can see it, the number is about 4%. of the total population, and this number is actually not really increasing. While as, and this is something that is very, that has to be dealt with just awareness, that at the same time we can see the number of our customers or patients is increasing, at least in Austria, to almost more than 30% over the next years. So I have a quote here that in the future, no EMS provider can employ or can continue to regard personnel as an interchangeable pass-through factor. What are basically consequences of high staff turnover? So one cannot say that high staff turnover is a bad thing. In general, it is both. So you can have some negative consequences. You can see them on the left in orange. So there's an economic burden of non-service. There's disruption of the communicative patterns. There's performance issues. But at the same time, turnover, so people leaving, could also mean that poor performers are eventually going, or there's new potential for external innovation, or conflicts that have been going on for a long time can be resolved. So in general, the question should be, how dysfunctional is staff turnover? And this brings me to my research question. So what are the characteristics of occupational engagements of EMS staff of this Western Austrian provider, and what factors can be identified that attract and repel staff? So why are people going into EMS, and why are they leaving EMS, and how long are they actually staying? What did I actually do? I did a descriptive retrospective analysis. So I used the German word is Dienstpläne. I used the Dienstpläne, the service plans, and looked at them and just figured out over the time of 6.25 years, how many people were there. This was about 25, and they were distributed over 3 stations and 2 emergency doctor stations. Those were included, and I identified at least 2 staff that I could do semi-structured interviews with and ask them why they actually chose to go into EMS and why did they leave EMS. And there is a very easy formula or equation to determine turnover rates. So the Fluktuationsquote in German, which is basically just the number of departure divided by the average numbers of employees, and this over a certain period of time. So I briefly want to show you some of the results, and then we can head into the discussion. There are in total 30 departed staff. The total annual turnover rate is about 19%. So about 1/5 of the staff leaves the organization in 1 year. And per group, so we will see that later more in detail. So the group of the emergency doctor car drivers, they have a very low fluctuation or turnover rate. And at the same time, the semi-urban station guys had a very high turnover rate. So let's look at this in a very short, detailed analysis. So we can see the doctor cars, they only had 1 peak in 2016, while as in 2016, the rural guys had almost half of them left. And the semi-urban, which is a very inconsistent station, had a high peak in 2013 and another peak in 2017. And finally, the urban station had a peak in 2018 with almost half of them going or leaving. And this what it looks in total. So about the peak was about 25%, like I said, of annual staff turnover. So starting from this, I wanted to know what actually, how long did actually this, the members stay? And I could pick out, because I only had the shift plans between 2013 and 2019, I could pick out only the people I knew who started after 2013 and left before 2019. So they accounted for about 5.3% of the annual turnover. So they were about 10, and in total about 20% of the turnover. And if you look at how long they stayed, the minimum stay was 3 months, the maximum stay was almost 20 months, but in average, no longer than almost 3/4 of a year. And what was their status when leaving? Like I said, the Austrian system is quite different. So in module 1, which is a very fast training, were 7, so only 260 hours, but 2 out of the 7 were in further training. And in module 3 and above, there were 3 of them. So I asked the people, why did you actually go into EMS, and what was your motivation, and what was the situation you found in EMS, and what made you leave the EMS? So what came back in the interviews was that the enjoyment of the activity was some of the main motivations to go into emergency medical services, to turn your hobby into your profession. Shift service, digitalization as a driver, so having ECG, monitoring new cars and all that kind of equipment. But there was also the short training criticized, and the system, EMS, and non-emergency transport. So the split between these two systems was also criticized by one participant. The payment was a factor that led people to leave, and the lagging development because of the strong voluntary involvement, especially in the situation in Austria. And to sum it all up, one of the participants said, it's a nice job for transition periods, but it's not something you would engage for a longer time. I just leave it as a comment. So what is the discussion and the limitations? There is, to my understanding, an alarming turnover with regional peaks. So the semi-urban area, for instance, there's a tendency towards dysfunctional turnover, which may paralyze the organization. So a high turnover is definitely not something good. And there are indications that turnover rates have not one causal reason. So there is not money, there's not shift service, but it's a variety of factors. And I can just introduce one. For instance, Herzberg's motivational and hygiene theory basically says that there are 2 kinds of factors, the motivators and the hygiene factors, and both of them have to be provided to neither leave, but also to stay and do a good job. And there are indications for a missing occupational identity of EMS staff. This came very clear to me. This was a voluntary research by myself. I had no funding, and I had to interrupt it by the effects of COVID-19. And I would say that further research is needed, especially because I figured out that regional differences are very, very apparent, very obvious. I think it should do some inferential statistics on that, and some more interviews, or just integration of theories, just as I said, Herzberg's motivation factor theory. And I myself am a member of the EMS provider. And if you want to contact me, I will be happy, and I would just say we can go into the discussion, and I'm happy for your questions and anything you want to discuss.